We are currently under the clouds of certain kinds of criminality by states, whether it's Israel, the USA, or India. Okay, is this better? So what I thought, because all of us are actually quite clear about the issue, that Palestine belongs to the Palestinians, that Israel is an apartheid state, it is a settler, it's a settler power. We know these things, but I'm using this opportunity to build a different kind of a background and enable us to think about Palestine not in a different way, but with our hearts rather than with our heads. Let me begin by paraphrasing the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg, who said this. In history, he said something like this, I'm paraphrasing it, I don't have the exact quote, unfortunately. In history, as in cinema, every close-up or every image implies an ongoing off-screen scene. This is a very important point to remember when we think about history, because there's a tendency on the part of authoritarian states and majoritarian politics to pick up one picture and insist that we only look at it. Only look at October 7th. Let's start and end everything with October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel. So we are supposed to begin every discussion on the latest phase of this ferocious 77-year-old war that Israel has been waging on the Palestinian people, and each of us has to continuously answer the question, but do you condemn Hamas? This belligerent question reminds me of the words of the Palestinian poet Murid Barghouti, who said, if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story, but start with secondly. Start with and end with the close-up. Start with and end with the freeze frame. Obliterate the ongoing off-screen scene. Bassem Youssef, Egyptian comedian and television host, was pushed on a television show to condemn Hamas, and this is how he answered that question. He said, imagine a world without Hamas. What would that world look like? Let us give this world a name and let us call it West Bank. Hamas has no control over West Bank, but here in 2023 August alone, 37 Palestinian kids were killed in just that 1 month, in August, long before Hamas attacked from Gaza, and Hamas has in any case absolutely no power in the West Bank. And he goes on to say there was no music festival, no paragliding, no Hamas. Since the occupation of the West Bank, 7,000 Palestinians have been killed. All this was before this current genocide. No music festival, no paragliding, no Hamas. In other words, Palestinians and those who support Palestine are continuously called upon to condemn acts of violence by the Palestinian resistance, but nobody is called into television studios to condemn the ongoing acts of mass violence for over 75 years by the apartheid Israeli state. We know this, but at every opportunity, we need to say this again and again, that the migration of Jews from all over the world into their so-called homeland was not into a space that was vacant of people. The Palestinians living there for millennia had to be forcibly evicted. We have to say this again and again, because they have destroyed the Palestinian people, they are destroying the Palestinian people. We have to pick up their flag and we have to speak for them. So the Palestinians living there for millennia had to be forcibly evicted. There has been a steady swallowing of Palestinian lands by Jewish settlements, herding of Palestinian people into continually shrinking little slivers of land of West Bank and Gaza. How is Palestinian land taken over? By a variety of strategies. By military force with guns and bombs, primarily from non-combatant farm families. By demolishing Palestinian homes on flimsy legal grounds or punitively. I'll come a little while later to the Zionist Hindutva brotherhood, but you can see that some very fine lessons have been learned from the Zionists by those who run Hindu Rashtriya. So Palestinian homes are demolished on flimsy grounds or punitively, and many suddenly homeless Palestinians have to vacate their land, which is then taken over for Jewish families. To add insult to injury, the Knesset passed a law in 2011 that would require Palestinians to pay for the demolition costs of their own homes. And now the strategy is to make Palestinians self-demolish their own homes. Didn't we see this happening in India recently? Until 19, that is, you are told, if you don't demolish these parts of your home, the bulldozers will come. Until 1948, there was no Israel, and the map showed a country called Palestine. But from 1948, there is only Israel, and Palestinians are encroachers, criminals, and terrorists in their own land. This is why the Birzeit University Union statement after October 7th said unequivocally, an occupying colonial power cannot claim the right to self-defense against the people under its brutal occupation. There is no moral equivalence between the colonizer and the colonized. This is the firstly with which we need to begin. What is the secondly? That Hamas is a creation of Israel and its allies. Hamas was launched in 1988 in Gaza at the time of the first Intifada with a charter that denied legitimacy to the existence of the Israeli state. But in a pattern familiar with imperialist powers all over the globe, Israel had, for a decade or so prior to 1988, supported the emergence of the Islamist force that became Hamas as a counter to Yasser Arafat's Fatah party, which formed the heart of the PLO. A leftist guerrilla movement, Israel considered it its main enemy and divide and rule. After the 1993 Oslo Accords, the situation changed. Israel formally recognized the PLO. Hamas became the enemy. Hamas refused to accept Israel or renounce violence. And as a journalist put it, Ishan Tharoor, that Hamas became perhaps the leading institution of Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. And that is the reason, not only religious ideology, that is the reason for its continued popularity among Palestinians. If anyone is standing up to the Israeli state today, it is the Hamas. In 2007, Hamas won the election in Gaza, a development that annoyed both the West and Fatah. Once Hamas took over Gaza, Israel began its strict blockades and turned Gaza into the largest open-air prison in the world. So really a lot of Palestinians who may or may not have supported Hamas, on October 7th, they described that attack as a prison break because Gaza had become the largest open-air prison in the world. This is the ongoing off-screen scene in which October 7th saw the beginning of a prison breakout and the brutal repression that followed on all the remaining prisoners of Gaza. We know what we are up against, all of us. Carol Cadwalader, the journalist who broke the story of Facebook selling user data to Cambridge Analytica, you may remember this story. Cambridge Analytica is the data analytics firm that was behind Trump's 2016 campaign and played a role in Brexit. So Cadwalader calls these states, the states under which we live, techno-authoritarian surveillance states. Who benefits most if war and violence continue indefinitely? The international arms industry. It's boom time for weapons makers and a chance for the USA to build military ties in a network of alliances in which India is very much a potential junior partner, aiding in the US ambition of stretching across the Indo-Pacific. And the Indian state and Israel have close military ties too, as does the biggest crony capitalist of India and the Israeli military state complex. We have seen all over the world how the expression of support to Palestine is criminalized, especially in universities. In US universities, people have lost jobs, financial support, been deported, arrested. And in India, there is an effective ban on speaking up for Palestine. We know this. This is why we're unable to march on the streets, because people are picked up, arrested, detained the moment you say the word Palestine. We've been seeing this all over the country. There is an effective ban on speaking up for Palestine. No public demonstrations can be held. No talks can be organized. Social media posts can result in being jailed, especially if you're Muslim. The Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, one of the most brutal anti-Muslim state governments in India today, soon after the latest phase of the genocide began, warned, and I am quoting how he was reported in the papers, warned against any activity contrary to the views of the center on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, quite apart from the fact that people have the right to hold opinions contrary to any of the views of the central government on any issue whatsoever, the interesting thing is that the Indian government has in fact expressed views that carefully do not alienate its West Asian allies by condemning, on the one hand, the violation of humanitarian law and terrorism, indicating both Israel and Hamas. In addition, the Ministry of External Affairs has reiterated that India supports the establishment of, and I'm quoting the MEA circular, that India supports the establishment of a sovereign, independent and viable state of Palestine. So it's not very clear which view of the center we should not go against to avoid being jailed. But of course, geopolitical considerations behind formal statements by the Indian state is one thing. The compatibility of the Zionist agenda with the Hindutva agenda is another. Scholars have long noted affinities between Hindu nationalism and Zionism, rooted in the long history of Hindutva's admiration of Zionist ethno-nationalism, possibly because both have found a common enemy in Islam. The other thing Zionism and Hindutva have in common is their view of the territory of their respective countries. Israel is supposedly the sacred land of the Jews, and India is supposedly the Punya Bhumi of the Hindus. So this kind of brotherhood between two fascist ideologies, two fascist anti-democratic ideologies, this brotherhood, I don't like to usually use the term brotherhood, but here I want to say brotherhood. It's a very masculine alliance, and that's very clear. Another somewhat terrifying feature of the world which we inhabit is the relentless mediatization of the world in which we live. By that I mean the way in which we encounter the world through the media. A student of JNU, Avantika Tiwari, who finished her PhD from here, who just submitted her PhD this year, wrote a brilliant essay in the Indian Express. That's what JNU students do. They leave JNU and they go and write brilliant essays everywhere. The idea is we should take JNU out of JNU. Take JNU out of Delhi. Go do your PhDs in other cities. Go take your jobs in other cities. JNU has to flower outside the heart of Hindu Rashtra as well. So Avantika wrote this amazing essay, and it really taught me so much. It was an op-ed in the Express. She says, day after day, images of bombed schools, lifeless children, desperate families clutching the few belongings they can carry, pour into the timelines of millions around the world, into our timelines, into our social media timelines. Images of bombed schools, lifeless children, desperate families clutching the few belongings they can carry, pour into the timelines of millions around the world. Each post is a demand to bear witness, an attempt at not letting people look away. And yet, within hours, sometimes minutes, these images vanish beneath an avalanche of unrelated content. A trending joke, a makeup tutorial, a football highlight, an ad for instant noodles. She concludes her critique of the mediatized access to the world by insisting that speech must go beyond what she calls the endless scroll, by building independent archives of testimonies, images, and records outside the reach of algorithmic suppression. It means forming solidarities between creators, I'm quoting her, it means forming solidarities between creators, journalists, archivists, and lawyers to defend against censorship and legal harassment. It means developing habits of sustained attention that refuse the platform's demand for constant novelty, returning to the same testimonies, the same images, the same stories until they imprint themselves into political action. This is what we have to do. We have to get out of the loop of the endless scroll and make things happen in this world. And so in the spirit of Sumud, this is a word I learned from Palestine when I was privileged to visit Birzeit University in 2013, and I learned the word Sumud for the first time. It's an Arabic word which now has become common. Everyone knows the word Sumud. This is what Palestine has done for us. We all know this word. And it is a word that means steadfastness, determination, sticking to your ideals with a sense of responsibility and ethics. So in the spirit of Sumud, I want to, as I move towards the last third of my talk, I want to focus today now on, we've already talked about the villains. Let's talk about the heroes, the people. Let's talk about resistance and care. We may note some clear features of the, sorry, this thing keeps slipping. We may note some clear features of the global resistance to the genocide, from the millions in the streets, to football fans, to the brave international community that set out with humanitarian aid on the Madeleine, all of whom have now been deported or detained by Israel, and the ship has been seized, as you know. So what I'm saying, what I see, what we all see all over the globe is the clear disjuncture between the people and the authoritarian states. We see the sharp divide between the people of a range of political persuasions, even on the left. They're not all, they don't all agree on everything. They agree on Palestine. This is how we have to build a movement here. There are, I think, at least 3 groups in JNU which are organizing events around Palestine. We may not agree on everything. Let's agree on Palestine. Let's have one massive march for Palestine in JNU, across the left. Whatever your differences on everything else, let's march for Palestine. That we are all agreed on. And that's what we see all over the world. Anarchists, Trotskyists, it doesn't matter. They're all on the streets together. So we see the sharp divide between the people of a range of political persuasions, even on the left, and the ruling elites, including all political parties. The ethically and financially corrupt governments of the world. Literally, I can't think of a single government that can call itself ethical today. The ethically and financially corrupt governments of the world are being called out by their citizenry to stand up for justice. The hopeful glimmers of aspirations towards a more direct democracy have often pierced the growing darkness of authoritarianism. In this century, whether in the Arab revolts or the anti-capitalist movements in the global north, we are the 99% and so on, or in various mass movements in India, none of these have resulted in systemic change, that's true, but the seeds sown by such electrically charged moments only lie dormant. The first quarter of the 21st century has shown us that we can expect the continuous resurgence of mass protests on multiple issues globally. The suddenness of these protests and their refusal to die down indicate long-term change in the making, I believe, towards direct democracy in the long term. As teachers and students, we have found our voices stifled in this country. We have been punished bureaucratically, financially, by losing jobs, for being jailed for years without trial, or by having the threat of arrest held over our heads if we express views critical of Hindutva, which is essentially Brahminical supremacism, or if we are critical of capitalism or of the authoritarian Indian state. What we have seen in the past 10 years is an accelerated and intensified form of control over both freedom of expression and academic freedom. What does it mean that those showing solidarity with Palestinians are being criminalized by state authorities in many parts of the world, while in many European countries, Israelis and Jews more generally are being portrayed as victims. The conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is most pronounced in Germany with its load of historical guilt, which it has conveniently pushed on the Palestinians to bear. The flip side of the conflation is the conflation of Palestinians with terrorism. The Frankfurt Book Fair cancelled the award for Palestinian author Adania Shibli's novel Minor Detail, which juxtaposes the true story of the rape and murder of a Bedouin girl by an Israeli army unit in 1949 with the fictional story of a female journalist investigating the crime in Ramallah decades later. What possible ethical justification can there be for holding an independent Palestinian writer accountable for the actions of a political group? In the discussions around this, I have come across a thought-provoking shift, an attempt by Palestinian scholars to reframe the question of academic freedom away from the rights of academics to express their views to the rights of those rendered invisible by the prohibition of speech on them. I found this very destabilizing for myself because it shook me that the point they were raising was something that has to do with me as well. Each one of us has to constantly question ourselves as to whether we live up to the grander ideals that we would like to espouse. So what Palestinian academics have been saying with reference to academic freedom is that academic freedom is spoken about as the freedom of academics and scholars to speak up. But we have to shift that debate, we have to shift that understanding towards the rights, from the rights of academics to express their views, our views, to the rights of those rendered invisible by the prohibition of speech on them. The point is not my right to speak about the Palestinians. The point is the rights of the Palestinians. That is the shift that they are talking about. They are doing this in the specific context of Israeli universities, of course, because then with Israeli universities there are questions of land grab, occupation and military service. But we can think about this more generally. How to expand or reframe questions of academic freedom in terms of the right to exist of people and politics on whom there is a prohibition of speech, of people on whom there is a prohibition of speech. What we then have to confront is the fact that academic freedom would be truly threatening to an unjust order only if it went beyond the free speech of academics, only when academic freedom is seen as an initial step alone. I want to remember here Rachel Corrie, the 23-year-old American citizen who was in Rafah, a city in Gaza, as part of an international solidarity initiative in 2003. She was 23 years old. She was the age of many of you here, and decades younger than me. She was part of an international solidarity initiative in 2003 where the Israeli military was demolishing Palestinian houses at the height of the Second Intifada. Rachel stood resolutely before a bulldozer to protect a Palestinian home, and the bulldozer mowed her down. Only when the academic is ready to place her body before the bulldozer, as Rachel was, can the discussion on academic freedom be truly productive. But I also know that most of us, including myself, are not ready for that step. Not yet. So we must keep up the speech, at least. At the very least, we can keep up the speech. In the emerging political configurations, there are all kinds of discussions about what sort of solution is possible for Palestine, and a two-state solution, which seems increasingly impossible actually. The more radical elements are really now thinking, including anti-Zionist Israelis, are thinking in terms of one democratic state of Israel-Palestine with equal rights for all, rather than two states, because that two-state solution may not be, because of Israel's policies, it may not be possible to implement any longer. I'm not taking a position on this. Saeed also was for a one-state solution, because we might want to think about the fact that we should be pushing for democratic multi-ethnic states, That should be our goal. Democratic, multi-ethnic states, not states which represent some particular ethnic group. So I may have a leaning towards the one-state solution, but it's not my debate. It's not for me to take a position on this. I'm listening to the debate. We're all listening to the debate. So these debates are going on as to what can happen. And I would like to conclude with talking about Gaza also in a somewhat different way. Because on the one hand, it is the living picture of the devastation wreaked by the viciousness of techno-authoritarian, surveillance-driven, capitalist and ethno-nationalist states. But Gaza is not only the pictures of people, starving people. Gaza is not pathetic. Gaza is not pathetic. I think we have to remember that. And Gaza becomes the flashpoint at which human aspirations to justice are illuminated. So let me conclude with a very short kind of an account by Asam Al-Nabi, a PhD scholar resident of Gaza. We have to amplify Palestinian voices wherever we can, whenever we can. It is not for us to claim Palestine. It is for us to carry the flag until they can carry it themselves, and they are carrying it themselves. But Asam, I cannot even imagine what this means to say that he's a PhD scholar resident of Gaza. Imagine if JNU was right now under, JNU is under attack, but not with bombs yet. So I don't even know what it means for a person to be a PhD scholar, to be a scholar, to be a resistor, and then to write this piece. The piece is called The Last Date in Gaza. Not date as in Tinder, but date as in khajur. It's just a date, a single 4-centimeter piece of dried fruit. But here in Gaza, where nothing comes easily and everything holds meaning, even a date becomes a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and love. I kept this date for 6 months. I'd found it and saved it for what I imagined would be the darkest days. The days when food would disappear from the shelves, when starvation would wrap itself around our lives, when sharing even a crumb would become an act of resistance. Those days are now. A few weeks ago, I decided the time had come to part with my little treasure. I gave that single date to my mom. The next morning, she passed it on to my youngest sister, Nesma. And then Nesma gave it to our 2-year-old nephew, Moem. That one date, passed from hand to hand, became a quiet act of love in a world collapsing around us. Momen was born just 2 months before the war started and will grow up without his father, Motaz Raja, who was killed during the genocide. Momen will never remember his father's voice, but at this moment, he received a date. And with it, he received a story he will hear again years later. No one in my family wanted to eat the last date and deny someone else its sweetness. That's who we are in Gaza. Not survivors, but givers. We give even what little we have left, not because we are saints, but because love and dignity are all we can hold on to when everything else has been taken from us. War can reveal the worst in people. Here in Gaza, it also brings out the best. Our streets are filled with pain and rubble, but also with kindness. The date is gone now, eaten by a child too young to know what it means. But the act remains, rippling outward like a pebble cast into water. It is in these ripples, in the stories we tell, in the way we refuse to forget that Gaza lives on. This is Asam Al-Nabi. And reading this story and reading about so many amazing stories of heroism, courage, love, solidarity that we see from Gaza, Gaza today represents for humanity globally, for all of us, a symbol of resilience, love, solidarity, and hope. Gaza is a courageous little candle held up against the unrelenting dark storm of injustice. And the people of the world know this. Even in the heart of Israel, there are people who know this. what the masses pouring out on the streets all over the world with the cry of free, free Palestine are reaching out to is that brave little flame of hope and sumud. Our hope is that that little flame will rekindle our collective humanity. It is not we who will save Gaza, Gaza will save us.